Marcus stood in chains beneath the Colosseum, still wearing the torn remnants of his Dacian warrior garb. 3 weeks ago, Roman legions had decimated his village. The soldiers promised that fighters who surrendered would be granted clemency, perhaps even citizenship if they proved their worth. Marcus believed them. He had watched his wife and daughter cut down during the siege. He had nothing left to fight for except survival. The guards dragged him through limestone corridors reeking of blood and feces. Above, he could hear the roar of 50,000 voices, a sound like thunder that never stopped. They told him he would demonstrate his courage before the emperor. Show Rome his warrior spirit, they said, and freedom would follow. The iron gate lifted, and Marcus squinted against the sudden blast of sunlight. The arena stretched before him, a vast oval of blood-soaked sand littered with bones and scraps of torn flesh from earlier entertainments. The crowd's roar intensified to a deafening pitch. Then he saw what awaited him. 3 starved lions paced behind a secondary gate on the opposite side. Their ribs protruded sharply beneath matted fur. Someone had cut them, deliberately across their flanks. Fresh wounds designed to enrage them further. Marcus had no armor, no shield. Just a dull gladius that felt like a toy in his trembling hand. The realization hit him with the force of a catapult stone. There would be no freedom, no clemency, no citizenship. Rome had promised him a warrior's chance to prove himself, but this was no fight. This was execution dressed up as sport. The very men who had promised him mercy now sat in the stands, drinking wine and placing bets on how long he would last. The lion's gate opened with a grinding screech of metal on stone. But what Marcus didn't know yet was that surviving this horror would only guarantee him something far worse. Because in Rome's arenas, death was merciful. It was living that destroyed you. Marcus survived the lions. Barely. The memory of those 18 minutes played constantly behind his eyes like a recurring nightmare. He had killed 2 of them somehow. The third had torn open his left thigh before collapsing from blood loss from its own wounds. Guards dragged Marcus from the arena, not to freedom, but to the ludus, the gladiator school beneath the city. The lanista, the trainer who owned Marcus's life now, was a former gladiator named Quintus. Half his face was a mass of scar tissue where a trident had torn it open years ago. His first words to Marcus were delivered with absolute clarity. "You think you fought well? You're livestock now, profitable livestock. You'll fight until you're not profitable anymore." The ludus was a stone prison designed to break men into obedient killers. 40 fighters crammed into cells meant for 20. The food was a thin gruel of barley and beans, measured precisely to keep them alive but constantly hungry. Water was rationed. Medical care consisted of a drunk Greek physician who cauterized wounds with red-hot iron and left infections to resolve themselves or kill the patient. The training was systematic brutality. Marcus learned that gladiators were organized into types, each with different weapons and armor. He would be a murmillo, carrying a heavy rectangular shield and short sword. Every morning began at dawn with weapons drills, swinging wooden practice swords until his shoulders screamed. Then came the beatings. Quintus believed pain taught faster than instruction. When Marcus's footwork was wrong, he received strikes across his back with a wooden rod. When he dropped his guard, Quintus's assistants would slash his arms with training swords deliberately sharpened enough to cut. "The arena won't warn you," Quintus would say while Marcus bled onto the training ground. "Neither will I." But the physical torture was just the foundation. The psychological destruction ran deeper. Marcus watched as new fighters arrived weekly, most of them prisoners of war like himself. Some were criminals, rapists, and murderers who believed the arena gave them a chance at redemption. They were wrong. Everyone was wrong about what the games actually were. 3 weeks into his training, Marcus witnessed something that shattered whatever hope remained in his chest. A fighter named Decimus had survived 15 matches. 15. The lanista announced that Decimus had earned his rudis, the wooden sword that symbolized freedom. The fighters cheered. Decimus wept with joy. The next morning, Quintus appeared with 2 guards. They dragged Decimus back to the training yard and bound him to a post. Quintus announced that Decimus's owner, a senator named Appius, had refused to grant freedom. Decimus was too valuable, too popular with the crowds. The Rudes was a lie, a prop for the ceremony. Decimus would fight until he died, like everyone else. They whipped Decimus in front of the entire ludus. Not enough to kill him or permanently damage him, just enough to remind everyone what they actually were. Property. Quintus made every man watch. When Decimus finally stopped screaming and hung limp against the post, Quintus turned to the assembled fighters. "You're not warriors," he said. "You're not heroes. You're animals we've trained to bleed for profit. The moment you forget that, you'll suffer worse than him." That night, Marcus heard Decimus weeping in his cell. By dawn, Decimus had torn strips from his tunic and hanged himself from the cell bars. The guards cut him down, cursed the waste of an investment, and threw his body onto a cart with the training dummies and broken equipment. Marcus lay on the stone floor of his cell, his infected thigh wound throbbing with each heartbeat, and understood the complete scope of his situation. The lions had been mercy. This was the real sentence. And the worst part, the part that made his stomach twist with nausea, was that this was just the beginning. Because tomorrow, Quintus would start teaching them how to kill each other. And next month, Marcus would face his first real match, where the crowd would decide if he deserved to breathe another day. In Rome's entertainment machine, survival wasn't victory. It was just postponing the inevitable. And the inevitable, Marcus was learning, was always more horrific than death itself. 4 months after arriving at the ludus, Marcus received his summons, his first official match in the Colosseum. Not against animals this time, but against another man, a retiarius, a net fighter, condemned for murdering a magistrate's son. The lanista told Marcus this was an honor. The crowd loved watching different fighting styles clash. Marcus would be the heavily armored Mamillo against the nearly naked, agile net fighter. The night before the match, Marcus vomited until nothing remained in his stomach. His cellmate, a Gaul named Brennus, who had survived 8 fights, offered what passed for comfort in the ludus. "Make it quick," Brennus said. "Don't let it drag out. The crowd gets bored when fights end too fast, but they get angry when fighters won't engage. Find the middle ground or they'll kill you both for wasting their time." Marcus barely slept. When dawn came, slaves arrived to prepare him. They oiled his skin to make blood flow more dramatically for the crowd's viewing pleasure. They painted his shield with fresh colors. They checked his armor, not for his protection, but to ensure it looked impressive for the spectators. He was merchandise being prepared for display. The walk through the tunnel to the arena felt endless. The roar of the crowd built with each step, until it became a physical force pressing against his chest. Then the gate opened, and Marcus stepped into hell painted as glory. 50,000 voices screamed his name. They didn't know his name, of course. They just screamed, a wall of sound that obliterated thought. The retiarius stood across the sand, holding his trident and weighted net. The man was younger than Marcus, maybe 20, and terror showed clearly on his face. This was his first match, too. The fight began with the drop of a cloth. The retiarius circled, trying to use his reach advantage. Marcus remembered his training, kept his shield up, waited for an opening. The crowd grew restless after 2 minutes of cautious movement. Someone threw a piece of fruit, then another. The message was clear: engage or be punished. Marcus charged. The retiarius threw his net but missed. Marcus's shield slammed into the younger man's chest, driving him backward. His gladius found flesh, slicing deep into the retiarius's thigh. Blood sprayed across the sand in an arc that caught the sunlight. The crowd roared its approval. The retiarius fell, dropping his trident. Marcus kicked it away. The fight was over. He had won. The younger man clutched his thigh, blood pumping between his fingers, and looked up at Marcus with eyes that said, "Please, please don't, please." Marcus turned to the emperor's box, raising his bloodied sword. This was the moment of mercy, where the victor asked the crowd for judgment. He expected the thumbs up, the signal of life granted. He had fought well. His opponent had fought well. Both had given the crowd their spectacle. The crowd's roar shifted. Marcus didn't understand at first. Then he saw the gesture rippling through the stands, thumbs turned downward, not scattered, not divided, a wave of downturned thumbs, 50,000 of them, demanding death. The emperor, a bored-looking man named Commodus, who was eating grapes and barely paying attention, gave a lazy thumbs down without even looking at the arena floor. Marcus stood frozen. The retiarius was still alive, bleeding but alive, looking at Marcus with desperate hope that evaporated as understanding dawned. The crowd began to chant, "Ugula, Ugula, Ugula, kill, kill, kill." A guard at the arena's edge shouted at Marcus, "Finish it or you'll join him." Marcus's hands shook so violently, he nearly dropped his gladius. He approached the fallen retiarius. The younger man didn't beg. He just closed his eyes and turned his head to expose his neck. Marcus had killed enemies in war, men who were trying to kill him. But this was different. This was execution. This was murder for entertainment. He drove the blade down. The retiarius's body jerked once, then went still. Blood pooled rapidly around them both. The crowd exploded in approval, cheering and stomping their feet. Marcus stood over the corpse of a man whose name he didn't know, while 50,000 people celebrated the killing they had commanded. Guards dragged the body away with hooks, leaving a thick trail of blood across the sand. A slave rushed out to rake the area clean for the next match. The whole process took less than 3 minutes. The retiarius's death, his entire existence, erased in the time it took to prepare for the next entertainment. Marcus returned to the ludus in a daze. Brennus greeted him with congratulations. "You survived! That's all that matters!" But Marcus couldn't stop seeing the retiarius's eyes in those final moments. Couldn't stop hearing the crowd's bloodlust, their joy at commanding death like gods dispensing judgment. He had won his first match, proven his worth, given Rome its spectacle, and his reward was the guaranteed certainty that he would have to do this again, and again. Until the day the crowd's thumbs pointed down for him instead. Because in Rome's arenas, victory wasn't freedom. Victory was just permission to die another day. And Marcus was beginning to understand that each day survived was another day of carrying the weight of the men he would be forced to kill. Men who, like him, were just trying to survive an empire that consumed human beings as casually as its citizens consumed their breakfast bread. The crowd had cheered today, but Marcus knew something they didn't. Eventually they would grow bored of him too, and when that day came, no amount of skill or courage would save him from the thumbs that turned downward. 2 years passed. Marcus survived 23 matches. His body became a map of violence, each scar a story of near death. A trident had punctured his right shoulder, leaving him unable to lift that arm above his head without sharp pain. A sword slash across his ribs had healed incorrectly, making deep breaths feel like knives stabbing his chest. 3 fingers on his left hand had been broken and never set properly, leaving them twisted and useless. But the physical damage was almost bearable compared to what was happening inside his mind. Marcus had killed 16 men. He remembered every face, every final expression, the Thracian who had begged in broken Latin, the criminal who had laughed as he died, finally free, the Germanic prisoner who had fought with such desperate fury that it took Marcus 4 minutes to bring him down, both of them sobbing by the end. 16 men whose blood had soaked into the arena sand while crowds cheered. The nightmares started after his 8th kill. Marcus would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, seeing the faces of the dead surrounding his cell. Brennus, who still survived in the cell next to him, said it happened to everyone eventually. "The ones who don't go mad are the ones you have to worry about," Brennus said. "Those are the real monsters." The ludus had evolved into something beyond a prison. It was a factory of psychological torment. The lanista had refined his techniques of control. Fighters who performed well were given extra food, occasional wine, sometimes even brief visits from prostitutes. Fighters who displeased the crowds were starved, beaten, denied water. The message was clear: your suffering can always get worse. Marcus witnessed things that convinced him Rome had perfected cruelty as an art form. When a fighter named Varro tried to escape, Quintus made an example that haunted every man in the ludus. They didn't kill Varro. Instead, they took his brother, also a gladiator, and forced Varro to fight him in a private match for the Lanista's wealthy guests. Both brothers refused initially, so Quintus had his guards break Varro's knees with iron bars. Then they gave his brother a choice. Kill Varro now, quickly, or they would torture Varro for days before killing them both anyway. Varro's brother, weeping, chose mercy. He killed his own brother with a single thrust through the heart, while Varro screamed for forgiveness that would never come. The Lanista's guests applauded the tragedy as if it were theater. Quintus had the surviving brother's face branded with the word fratricide and sent him to the mines. A fate considered worse than the arena because it promised years of suffering before death. Marcus's infected wounds became chronic problems. The ludus physician, still drunk most days, would cauterize new wounds with filthy instruments. Infections were common. Marcus watched men die from wounds that should have been survivable, their bodies rotting from the inside as fever consumed them. The physician would shrug and say weak blood before moving to the next patient. The psychological tactics extended into the arena itself. Marcus learned that matches were carefully orchestrated to maximize crowd engagement. Popular fighters were sometimes matched against multiple opponents simultaneously. Other times, they faced fighters armed with unfamiliar weapons to create interesting disadvantages. During his 19th match, Marcus faced a fighter he recognized from the ludus. Cassius, a Spaniard who slept 3 cells away. They had trained together, ate together, shared water rations during the hottest summer days. Now they stood across from each other in the sand, while Rome demanded they fight to the death for no reason except entertainment. They circled each other for minutes, neither wanting to engage. The crowd grew hostile. Food and stones began raining into the arena. A voice from the emperor's box shouted a command. Guards appeared at the arena entrances with loaded crossbows. The message was clear: fight or be executed where you stand. Cassius attacked first, not because he wanted to, but because survival instinct overrode everything else. The fight was brutal and joyless. 2 men who had no quarrel with each other, trying to kill one another because an empire demanded it. Marcus won by driving his gladius through Cassius's stomach, a slow and agonizing death. As Cassius died, bleeding out over several minutes because the wound had missed vital organs, he whispered to Marcus in Spanish, "Kill me faster next time. Don't let them make us suffer." But there wouldn't be a next time for Cassius. His body was dragged away with the others, tossed into a mass grave outside the city, where corpses of gladiators, criminals, and slaughtered animals rotted together. No marker, no remembrance, just meat discarded after its entertainment value was exhausted. Marcus returned to his cell that night and found Cassius's few possessions still sitting in his sleeping space. A carved wooden figure of a horse, a strip of cloth from his homeland. Small reminders that Cassius had been human, had been someone before Rome turned him into a spectacle. The psychological weight became crushing. Marcus began having episodes where he would lose time, standing motionless for hours, unable to remember where he was or what he was doing. The other fighters recognized the symptoms. They had seen it before. Marcus was beginning to break. Quintus noticed too. During a training session, he pulled Marcus aside. "You're losing your edge," the Lanista said. "The crowd senses weakness. You've got maybe 3 more fights in you before they get bored. After that..." He made a throat-slitting gesture. Marcus understood. His value as entertainment was depleting. The novelty of the Dacian warrior had worn off. Soon the crowd would want fresh blood, new faces, different deaths. And when that day came, no amount of skill would save him. That night, Marcus considered Decimus's choice. The hanged man who had chosen death over continued suffering. It would be easy, quick. But something stubborn in Marcus refused. Not courage, not hope. Just a base animal refusal to give Rome the satisfaction of breaking him completely. So he continued. Training, fighting, killing. each match eroding another piece of his humanity, turning him into something he didn't recognize when he caught his reflection in the bronze shields. His eyes had developed a 1,000-yard stare, the same look he saw in the eyes of veterans who had survived too many battles. But Marcus's war wasn't against enemies. His war was against an entertainment system that ground human beings into blood and spectacle, then discarded them when the crowds grew restless for something new. And the worst part? He was starting to get good at it. The killing came easier now. The faces of the dead haunted him less. He was becoming the very thing Brennus had warned about, a monster who had learned to thrive in hell because the alternative was immediate death. The crowd loved it. His 23rd match earned standing ovations. They chanted his arena name, Carnifex, the Executioner. They had no idea that every cheer, every celebration of his kills, was another nail in the coffin of whoever Marcus used to be before Rome captured him. Because the truth was simple and horrifying. Rome's entertainment machine didn't just kill gladiators' bodies, it killed their souls first, piece by piece, match by match, until nothing remained except trained killers too broken to remember they had once been human beings with families, with dreams, with lives that mattered. And Marcus's final transformation was still ahead of him. Marcus's 24th match arrived on a scorching afternoon in late summer. The heat rising from the arena sand created shimmering waves that distorted the crowd's faces into grotesque masks. He had been fighting for nearly 3 years now. His body was failing in ways that couldn't be hidden anymore. The infected shoulder wound had never properly healed, leaving him with limited range of motion. His ribs, broken and re-broken multiple times, made every breath a conscious effort. But the real damage was invisible. Marcus had stopped sleeping more than an hour at a time. When he did sleep, the nightmares were so vivid that he would wake up swinging, once nearly killing his cellmate Brennus, before recognizing where he was. He had developed a twitch in his left eye that never stopped. His hands shook constantly unless he was actually fighting, the only time his body remembered its training. The ludus physician, examining him before the match, had shaken his head. "You're done," he said flatly. "Your body's eating itself. You've got infection in that shoulder that's spreading. Another month, and you'll be dead from fever anyway." He paused, then added with clinical detachment, "Make this one count. It's probably your last." They led Marcus through the tunnel. The walk felt different this time, longer. Each step required conscious effort. Above, the crowd's roar sounded distant, like he was hearing it from underwater. His vision had developed strange dark spots that floated across his field of view. The infection was spreading faster than the physician realized. The gate opened. Marcus stepped into the arena and immediately knew something was wrong. This wasn't a standard match. The sand had been raked into elaborate patterns. Weapons racks lined both sides of the arena. And standing across from him weren't 1 or 2 opponents. There were 5 of them. Marcus recognized the setup immediately, a damnatio ad gladium, execution disguised as sport. When a gladiator had outlived his entertainment value, when the crowd grew bored or the fighter became too damaged to provide good spectacles, the lanista would arrange a final match. Multiple opponents, fresh and healthy, against one exhausted, wounded fighter. The outcome was predetermined. This wasn't a fight. This was a death sentence with pageantry. The 5 fighters spread out in a semicircle. Marcus recognized 2 of them from the ludus. Young men, newly trained, being given an easy kill to build their confidence. The other 3 were criminals, promised freedom if they survived 5 matches. This would be their first. They had everything to gain and nothing to lose. The crowd sensed the mismatch. Their roar intensified, not with excitement, but with bloodlust. They knew they were about to witness an execution. That's what they had paid for. That's what Rome delivered. The signal dropped. The 5 fighters advanced simultaneously. Marcus's body moved on pure instinct, muscle memory overriding his failing mind. His gladius met the first attack, deflecting it. His shield blocked the second. But there were too many angles, too many weapons. A sword slashed across his back, opening a long wound from shoulder blade to hip. Another blade found his already damaged ribs, punching through weakened bone. Pain exploded through Marcus's body, so intense that his vision went white. He staggered, shield arm dropping. The fighters pressed their advantage, circling like wolves around wounded prey. Another cut across his thigh. A spear thrust that he barely deflected, but the force knocked him to his knees. The crowd roared its approval. This was the spectacle they had come to see. Carnifex the Executioner, brought low, the mighty fallen. It was entertainment at its purest Roman form. Marcus tried to rise, but his legs wouldn't respond properly. Blood was pouring from multiple wounds, soaking into the sand around him. One of the young fighters from the ludus, a kid no more than 18, approached with his sword raised. His face showed no mercy, no hesitation. Just the cold efficiency of someone doing a job. Something broke inside Marcus in that moment. Not his body, that was already broken. Something deeper. The last fragment of whoever he had been before Rome captured him shattered completely. He didn't want to fight anymore, didn't want to kill anymore, didn't want to be part of this grotesque machinery that turned human suffering into mass entertainment. The faces of the 16 men he had killed flashed through his mind. The Retiarius, Cassius, all the others whose names he had never learned. Marcus dropped his sword. The arena fell silent. 50,000 voices cutting off simultaneously created a vacuum of sound more shocking than their roars. Fighters dropping their weapons was the ultimate transgression. It was refusing to play the role Rome had assigned. It was rejecting the entire system. One of the criminals kicked Marcus's sword away. Another fighter, sensing opportunity, thrust his spear toward Marcus's exposed chest. But the crowd had shifted. This wasn't what they wanted. They wanted a fight, spectacle, drama. A man simply giving up and waiting to die was boring. The boos started, first scattered, then building into a wall of disapproval. The emperor, Commodus, stood from his seat and shouted something Marcus couldn't hear. Guards entered the arena, a dozen of them, carrying iron brands heated in braziers. They weren't going to let Marcus die quickly. He had broken the contract. Gladiators were supposed to fight until death, never surrender. The punishment for refusal was public torture, a warning to other fighters about what happened when you stopped providing entertainment. The guards grabbed Marcus, dragging him to the arena's center. They stripped away his armor, leaving him naked before the crowd. Then they began the torture. Heated iron pressed against his flesh, burning through skin and muscle. Marcus screamed, a sound that echoed through the Colosseum. The crowd's mood shifted again, pleased now. This was better than a simple execution. This was a lesson being taught. They burned him systematically. Arms, legs, chest, back. Each application of heated iron accompanied by Marcus's screams and the crowd's approval. The smell of cooking flesh filled the arena. After 20 minutes, they stopped. Not out of mercy, but because unconscious victims provided poor entertainment. Guards dragged Marcus back to the ludus. He was still alive, barely. The physician took one look at him and laughed bitterly. "Should have died in the arena," he said. "Would have been faster." Marcus lay in his cell, burned flesh weeping fluid, infection spreading through his body like wildfire. Brennus sat beside him, offering water that Marcus couldn't swallow. "You broke," Brennus said quietly. "We all break eventually. You lasted longer than most." For 3 days, Marcus lingered in a state between life and death. Fever consumed him, his body shutting down system by system. He hallucinated constantly, seeing the faces of the dead standing in his cell, watching him die. On the 4th day, mercifully, his heart stopped. They threw his body onto a cart with broken training equipment and animal carcasses from the morning's beast hunts. His corpse was dumped in a mass grave outside Rome's walls, a pit filled with the remains of hundreds of other gladiators, criminals, and executed prisoners. No marker, no ceremony, no acknowledgement that Marcus had ever existed. Within a week, another Dacian prisoner had taken his place in the ludus. The machine continued without pause. Marcus's corpse lay in the communal grave for 3 days before the heat and decomposition reached critical mass. The pit, already filled with dozens of bodies in various stages of decay, had been dug too shallow and filled too quickly. Rome's appetite for blood sport meant the graves filled faster than gravediggers could properly maintain them. On the 4th day after Marcus's disposal, the gases from decomposing bodies built up sufficient pressure. The pile of corpses shifted, a grotesque avalanche of rotting flesh and bone. Marcus's body, positioned near the top of the heap, rolled down the embankment and came to rest partially exposed to the open air. Wild dogs found him first, a pack of starving mongrels that lived off the waste of Rome's execution grounds. They tore into the burned flesh, fighting over pieces. By morning, Marcus's corpse was unrecognizable, scattered in chunks across the hillside. Crows and vultures joined the feast, reducing what remained to gnawed bones and scraps of tissue too rotten even for scavengers. The gravediggers, annoyed by the mess, shoveled the scattered remains back into the pit, without bothering to identify what belonged to whom. Marcus's bones mingled with those of criminals, prostitutes, and other discarded gladiators. Within a month, new bodies covered everything, creating layers of anonymous dead stacked like discarded merchandise. No one investigated what had happened to the Dacian fighter called Carnifex. The ludus had already replaced him. The crowds had already moved on to newer attractions. Rome's entertainment machine had consumed Marcus completely and ground him into nothing, literally erasing his physical body from existence. But the systematic horror of what Rome had done to Marcus wasn't unique. It was the standard process, repeated thousands of times, year after year, for over 3 centuries. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. Modern historians estimate that between 400,000 and 500,000 gladiators died in Roman arenas over the empire's lifespan. 500,000 human beings, captured or condemned, trained to kill each other, while crowds of up to 50,000 spectators cheered and placed bets on which man would bleed out faster. The Colosseum alone consumed approximately 10,000 lives per year during its peak operational period. 10,000 men, women, and sometimes children executed publicly as entertainment. That's nearly 30 deaths per day, every single day, for decades. The economic scale was staggering. A single day of games could cost the equivalent of millions in modern currency. Emperors bankrupted the treasury funding spectacles. Wealthy citizens competed to sponsor increasingly elaborate massacres. The entire economy of certain provinces revolved around supplying the arenas with condemned bodies, exotic animals, and weapons. And the crowds loved every second of it. Archaeological evidence shows that arena seating was designed with remarkable sophistication. Different social classes had designated sections. Food vendors circulated through the stands. Betting operations ran openly. Souvenir sellers hawked miniature gladiator figurines and commemorative cups. The Colosseum wasn't just an execution ground, it was a commercial entertainment complex built on industrial-scale human sacrifice. The psychological damage extended beyond the fighters. Roman children grew up watching public torture and execution as normal family entertainment. They learned that human life had entertainment value, that suffering was funny when it happened to the right people, that violence was admirable when properly staged. Multiple generations were raised to view mass killing as civic duty and public service. The medical community participated enthusiastically. Physicians studied gladiator wounds to advance anatomical knowledge. They experimented with treatments using arena fighters as test subjects. The famous physician Galen built his career on experience gained treating gladiators, learning surgery techniques by patching up men who would be sent back to die in subsequent matches. Even the religious establishment sanctioned the slaughter. Pagan priests blessed the games, calling them offerings to the gods. The blood spilled in arenas was considered sacred, pleasing to divine powers. Religious festivals featured extended gladiatorial combat as spiritual observance. Rome managed to transform systematic murder into holy ritual. The infrastructure supporting the games was massive. Networks of breeding farms supplied animals. Training schools operated in every major city. Weapons manufacturers specialized in arena equipment. Entire industries existed solely to feed the entertainment machine's appetite for death. Thousands of people made their living from the business of killing other humans for public amusement. And when Christianity eventually became Rome's official religion, the games didn't immediately stop. They continued for another century, gradually declining not from moral opposition, but from economic collapse as the empire fell apart. The arenas emptied because Rome could no longer afford the spectacles, not because anyone decided mass execution was wrong. The final gladiatorial match in the Colosseum occurred in 435 CE. By then, the empire was crumbling, the economy was devastated, and the infrastructure supporting the games had collapsed. The last gladiators died not in glory, but in a half-empty arena before a crowd too poor to care much about entertainment anymore. The Colosseum itself stood abandoned for centuries. Vandals stripped it of valuables. Earthquakes damaged the structure. It became a quarry, with builders taking stones to construct churches and palaces. The very building that had consumed 500,000 lives was cannibalized to build the new Christian Rome, its blood-soaked history literally built into the foundations of religious architecture. Today, the Colosseum is a tourist attraction. 4 million visitors per year walk through the passages where men like Marcus waited to die. They take selfies on the arena floor where blood once soaked the sand. Tour guides describe the engineering marvels, the architectural innovations, the clever systems for flooding the arena for naval battle reenactments. What they rarely discuss in detail is what actually happened there. The screams, the smell of burning flesh and spilled bowels, the psychological torture of forcing prisoners to kill each other for no reason, except that crowds found it entertaining. The children who watched people die and learned that violence was normal. The systematic dehumanization that turned human beings into disposable entertainment products. Rome called it civilization, called it justice, called it honoring the gods and entertaining the citizens, but strip away the marble and the rhetoric, and the Roman games were exactly what Marcus discovered them to be. Industrial-scale human sacrifice, dressed up as sport, sustained for centuries because an empire decided that watching people suffer and die was an acceptable form of public entertainment. The truly disturbing part isn't that Rome did this. It's that Roman citizens, millions of them across 3 centuries, watched it happen and cheered. They brought their families. They ate lunch while men died. They argued about fighter statistics and betting odds while human beings were tortured to death in front of them. And they considered this normal, civilized, even virtuous. Marcus's body rotted in an unmarked grave, consumed by scavengers, reduced to anonymous bones scattered among hundreds of thousands of others. His name was forgotten within days. His suffering provided a few hours of entertainment for people who never learned his story, never cared about who he had been before Rome captured him, and wouldn't have changed anything even if they had known. Because in the end, that's what Rome's entertainment machine really was, a systematic process for transforming human beings into forgettable spectacles, consuming their lives, erasing their identities, and grinding them into literal nothing while crowds applauded. And the empire that perfected this horror, that made industrial-scale human sacrifice into civic virtue, is still celebrated today as one of humanity's greatest civilizations. The Colosseum, where 500,000 people died for entertainment, is considered one of the world's architectural wonders. Marcus's story, and the stories of the hundreds of thousands like him, are barely footnotes in Rome's glorious history, just background statistics in the empire's grand narrative. Disposable lives fed into a machine that ran on blood and cheered its own cruelty as justice. That's the real legacy of Rome's games, not the architectural marvel or the cultural significance, but the demonstration that human beings, given the right circumstances and social permission, will enthusiastically participate in mass murder and call it entertainment, will bring their children to watch torture and call it education, will celebrate systematic dehumanization and call it civilization. Marcus died believing he was nothing, that his life had no meaning beyond what Rome extracted from it. And in Rome's eyes, he was right. He was product, entertainment, meat processed through a machine and discarded when it stopped being profitable. The horror isn't just what happened to Marcus. The horror is that it happened to 500,000 people, and the civilization that did it is still admired today. The Colosseum still stands, and tourists still marvel at its engineering while standing on ground soaked with centuries of blood. That's Rome's true legacy. Not glory, not civilization. Just the cold demonstration that human cruelty, when properly organized and socially sanctioned, has no limits. And that future generations will forget the screams and remember only the architecture.